Sooner or later, you'll find it necessary to remove and replace chips. It might be because they failed or because you feel the need to upgrade by replacing one or more chips. In any case, the procedure is the same. It's important to note that the procedure we're going to describe is for socketed chips. These chips are not soldered to the motherboard. Removing a solder chip is a completely different procedure and one that we won't cover in this course. Desoldering a chip is a difficult procedure that requires a great deal of practice. It's easy to damage a circuit board, especially the current generation of motherboards, by heating them. If a soldered chip fails, it's probably easier and cheaper in the long run to simply replace the entire motherboard.
The tools you'll need are a screwdriver or nut driver to open the case, a very small screwdriver, a chip puller, and an anti-static wrist strap. All of these come in the toolkit that is part of this course.
Now you're ready to open the system unit and gain access to the motherboard. This procedure is covered in a study unit and section 3 of this video, so we won't repeat it here. If you feel it's necessary, review section 3 of this video now.
First, identify the chip you're going to remove. You can refer to the study unit about the motherboard for information about identifying chips. We're assuming you've already bought new chips, so you can also compare the new chips to the ones on the motherboard. The chips that are most likely candidates for removal are the CPU, ROMs, and RAM.
Before attempting this procedure, the first and most important step is to ground the static buildup on your person. Now, the way you do this is to wear your anti-static wrist strap, attaching the clip at the end of the strap to a convenient ground source on the system chassis.
Check the orientation of the chip so you know which end goes toward the front of the computer and which toward the back. Again, drawing a diagram will help. A chip and its socket will often have an alignment mark. The new chip you're going to install should be oriented the same way as existing chips. You'll use a chip puller to loosen the chip in the socket. The ends of the chip puller have small lips that you can slip under the chip. Insert the chip puller between the chip and the socket and rock it gently, lifting first one end and then the other. Be sure you don't put the chip puller under the socket. If you try to loosen the socket, you might damage the socket or the motherboard. Once you've loosened the chip, use the puller to remove it the rest of the way. Gently pull the chip straight up. Don't pull it out on an angle and don't use excessive force, as you can bend the motherboard and loosen other chips in the process. To insert a new chip, first take a careful look at it. Be sure you know which end should be toward the back and which toward the front of the computer. Align the chip over the socket. Look at the legs to be sure they are all in the sockets. You may have to bend the legs a bit to get them to fit. When all the legs are in the socket, press the chip gently into place. It may be necessary to rock the chip back and forth slightly.
Replacing chips isn't difficult, although you may feel nervous the first time you try it. If you follow the directions we've presented in this video section, you shouldn't have any trouble. Just take your time, think carefully about what you're doing, and we're confident you'll do a good job.
The power supply on a PC converts household current, which is 120 volts AC, to plus or minus 5 volts and plus 12 volts DC. There are no repairable parts in a power supply, so if a problem arises, the only solution is to replace it. You might also want to replace a power supply if you have a souped-up PC and the components draw more current than the original power supply can provide. This is especially true on older PC systems that are noted for being underpowered. The only tools you'll need are a screwdriver or nut driver to open the case. Unplug the computer and open the system unit case to gain access to the power supply. This procedure is covered in section 3 of this video, so we won't repeat it here. If you feel it is necessary, review section 3 now. The power supply is the silver metal box in the back right corner of the computer. The power supply is obvious on some systems, like older PCs, XTs, and ATs. But on some newer systems, it's buried under a layer of other components. These components must be removed to gain access to the power supply. In most computers, connecting cables run from the power supply to the disk drives and to the motherboard. On a piece of paper, note which cables go where, and then unplug them. Be sure to indicate on your diagram that P8 goes toward the back connector on the motherboard and P9 goes toward the front. The power supply will be held in place by screws. They're usually found in the back of the system unit. Remove these screws, but be sure to keep them separate from the screws that held the system unit case in place. Slide the power supply forward slightly. This will disengage the clips on the bottom of the power supply that secure it in place. You can now remove the power supply from the system unit case.
Use the opposite procedure to install the new power supply. Put the power supply in place slightly forward of where it should be. Slip it backwards so it catches on the clips. You may have to slide it back and forth a few times until it catches. Use the 4 screws to attach the power supply to the back of the system unit.
Reattach the cables to the disk drives. You may end up with an extra cable or two because some newer power supplies have more than 2 disk drive cables. Just tuck the extra cables away in a convenient place. These cables are for additional disk or tape drives you might install at some time in the future. Reconnect the power cables to the motherboard. P8 goes toward the back, while P9 goes toward the front. You absolutely must install these cables in the correct plugs, or you will seriously damage the motherboard components. Fortunately, they are keyed, so you can't reverse them.
The final step is to reinstall the system unit case. You can refer to Section 3 of this video or the corresponding study unit for instructions on how to do this. The keyboard is one of the sturdiest components of a computer system. It's used almost constantly. It's abused regularly by spills and paper clips, yet it keeps on working. Only in extreme cases will a keyboard actually fail. More often than not, a keyboard will be replaced because of user preferences, not mechanical or electronic failure. We'd like to add here that a keyboard is much more complicated than it looks. If a problem ever develops with a keyboard, other than the routine things like a stuck key, you should replace rather than repair it. If you open up a keyboard and attempt to repair it, you'll discover that even if you can fix it, you probably won't get it back together again. Replacing a keyboard is the easiest upgrade you'll ever undertake. Turn the computer off and unplug the keyboard from the connector.
Plug in the new keyboard, being sure to align the connector properly. There's a slight dent in the top of the cable connector that aligns with a corresponding bump or key on the system unit connector. You may have to rotate the cable connector slightly to match the configuration of the connector on the system unit.
Adding a serial mouse to a computer system isn't much more difficult than replacing a keyboard. Be sure the computer is turned off and attach the mouse to the serial port. On some computers, you may have a port specifically for a mouse. You may have to secure the mouse by tightening the retaining screws that hold the connecting cable in place. A second type of mouse has its own interface board that fits into one of the connectors on the motherboard. This is called a bus mouse. Section 10 of this video describes how to add an expansion card to a PC. You should refer to it and the documentation that came with the bus mouse for installation directions. Both mouse types require that software be added to the system and that the system software itself be modified. The installation procedure will vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, so you should be sure to read the documentation carefully.